Imagine picking up, like, the most famous detective novel in history. You settle in, expecting a thrilling, winding mystery where you're just kept completely in the dark until the brilliant sleuth reveals everything at the very end.
Right, the classic reveal.
Yeah. But before you even turn to page one, the author actively shows you the trapdoors. Like, they point out where the floorboards are going to give way, where the lights are going to cut out, and where the monster is hiding. That doesn't really sound like a typical mystery, does it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's usually we expect to be put in the passenger seat.
Yeah, we just let the author drive the bus.
Right. We watch the scenery roll by, not really giving a single thought to the engine or, how the transmission is shifting gears. It's meant to be a passive experience, typically.
Mm-hmm.
A masterful storyteller usually wants you to forget you're reading a constructed piece of art.
Right, they want the illusion to be seamless.
Yeah, so you're lost in the narrative rather than thinking about the scaffolding holding it up.
But when you step into the world of Arthur Conan Doyle, and specifically the Hound of the Baskervilles, looking at the mechanics, like the literal structural bones of the book, that becomes half the thrill.
Oh, for sure.
So today, we're bringing you a book candy companion conversation from Claire and Horatio. We're going to look really closely at the architectural blueprint of this story.
And by that, we mean the front matter and the chapter titles.
Right, because if you read them closely, they reveal precisely how Doyle structurally builds tension. He isolates the characters and, by extension, he isolates you, the listener. It really proves why this piece of fiction remains a masterclass in pacing and is so worth your time today.
Yeah, the mission here is to trace how a story, one billed on the title page as Another Adventure of Sherlock Holmes, uses structural shifts to just fundamentally manipulate the audience.
Manipulate us how?
Or we're mapping how Doyle maneuvers us from this place of supreme, arrogant confidence into a state of primal fear, and then, eventually, back out again. We're going to look at sudden diary entries, broken threads, and really intense geographical isolation.
Okay, so break this blueprint analogy down for me. If I'm looking at the table of contents, what am I actually seeing? Because most people, we just see a list of pages and chapters.
Think of it like looking at an architect's floor plan before you actually walk through a physical house.
Okay.
If you know how to read the symbols on a blueprint, you can see where the hallways narrow drastically. You can anticipate the architectural squeeze. You know exactly where the dark corridors lead.
Oh, I see.
Right? So reading Doyle's chapter titles in sequence gives you that same predictive power. You're anticipating the tension before you even step foot in the narrative hallway.
I really like that visual. But before we even reach that floor plan, before we get to chapter 1, we sort of have to look at the plaque on the front door.
The author's note.
Right, the author's note, the dedication, because it completely shatters a very specific romanticized illusion we have about how great literature is made.
Oh, yeah. The image of the lone author, right? Sitting in a dimly lit garret, wrestling with the muses, just pulling a masterpiece entirely from their own isolated brilliance, the myth of the solitary genius.
Totally.
Instead, we see Arthur Conan Doyle, writing from Hindhead, dedicating this seminal book to a man named Robinson. He writes, My dear Robinson, Inception, for this and for your help in the details, all thanks.
Wait, I'm kind of confused by that. Doyle is at the absolute height of his fame here. This is the iconic Sherlock Holmes adventure.
Yeah, the one everybody knows.
Right. Even if you've never read a single word of Doyle, you know the Hound. So why would he voluntarily share the spotlight? Isn't he diluting his own brand as a solitary genius by admitting right on page 1 that the inception of the story, the very seed of the idea and the details, came from a friend?
It seems like that, right?
Yeah, it feels like a magician showing you how the trick is done before the curtain even goes up.
It is a really remarkable admission.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of what the Sherlock Holmes universe actually is, it makes perfect thematic sense.
How so?
Well, think about the core dynamic of the books. Sherlock Holmes is a genius, yes. But he is notoriously reliant on Dr. John Watson.
Right, he needs him.
He needs Watson for the details. He needs Watson as a sounding board to reflect his own logic back at him. So by acknowledging Robinson, Doyle is showing us that the creation of the mystery parallels the solving of it. The author, just like his famous detective, needed a collaborator to refine the raw material into something brilliant.
Oh, wow. So it's like life imitating art, or art imitating life. The lone genius is a fallacy on both sides of the page.
Spot on.
Holmes needs Watson to process the clues, and Doyle needed Robinson to process the narrative. It just immediately sets a tone of shared experience. We aren't, traversing this narrative alone, which brings us to the actual map of the house. the table of contents.
Right, and this map lays out a 5-act play, just hidden in plain sight. If we trace the opening chapters, we see a really profound clash of ideas happening before the plot even fully kicks in.
Okay, let's trace that clash. So Act 1, the setup and the clash of ideas. Chapter 1 is titled Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It kind of establishes the baseline, right? Order, logic, the quintessential Victorian man of science sitting in his very comfortable Baker Street rooms.
Yeah, and we need to ground that baseline for a moment. In that very first chapter, Doyle spends an enormous amount of time having Holmes and Watson analyze a forgotten walking stick left behind by a client.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, they deduce the man's profession, his age, his habits, even the type of dog he owns, entirely through logical deduction based on, like, teeth marks and scuffs on a piece of wood.
Right, it's wild.
It's a dazzling display of rationality. Doyle is telling the reader, look at the power of the scientific method. Look at how my hero can conquer the unknown with mere observation.
But then you hit Chapter 2, and the title throws this massive wrench into that comfort. It's called The Curse of the Baskervilles.
Yeah, in just 2 chapter titles, we have the central friction of the entire novel. Chapter 1 is pure rationality. Chapter 2 is pure, archaic superstition. It introduces an opposing force that supposedly operates entirely outside the realm of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's logical universe.
Right, because a curse is immune to deduction. You can't really put a centuries-old phantom under a microscope.
No, you can't.
Chapter 2 isn't about scuffs on a walking stick. It's about a terrified doctor reading a 1742 manuscript about this wicked ancestor, Hugo Baskerville, who kidnapped a maiden and had his throat ripped out by a giant glowing hound from hell. Like, how does the man of science combat a multi-generational supernatural curse?
He can't. Not on those terms, anyway. A curse implies inevitability, right? And divine or infernal punishment. So Doyle has to build a bridge between the realm of science and the realm of myth, and he does that in Chapter 3, which is simply titled The Problem.
I love that. That phrasing is doing so much heavy lifting. It's meticulous. Because a problem is something that can be solved. It transitions a supernatural terror, the curse, into a logical puzzle. It shrinks the infinite, terrifying unknown down into a finite equation that Holmes can dismantle.
Right.
And only once the curse has been downgraded to a problem can we properly introduce the client in Chapter 4, which is Sir Henry Baskerville.
Let me make sure I'm following this architecture. So by taking us from Holmes to curse to problem, you, the reader, are subliminally promised a victory of logic over fear.
Exactly.
We're primed to watch the great machine of Holmes's brain just chew up this spooky legend and spit out a rational explanation. We totally expect him to solve it right then and there in London.
But the floor plan drops out from under us. We enter Act 2, the failure and the shift in geography.
This is where the outline gets wild. Chapter 5 is titled 3 Broken Threads. Think about the visceral imagery of that. A thread is something you follow. It's a lifeline out of a labyrinth. It's the connective tissue of an investigation.
Yeah.
And here, not 1, not 2, but 3 of them snap. And we really need to look at what those threads actually are to understand the magnitude of this structural shift. Holmes, supremely confident, attempts to solve the mystery from the safety of London. He sets up 3 linear paths of inquiry.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first thread is tracing a mysterious warning letter sent to Sir Henry at his hotel. It's composed of words cut from a copy of the Times.
Right, the cutout newspaper words.
Yeah.
And the second thread is tracking down a bearded spy who was following Sir Henry in a hansom cab through the streets of London.
Yep. And the third thread involves locating Sir Henry's boots.
The boots.
Yeah, they keep getting stolen from his hotel room, this bizarre, seemingly senseless pattern. First a new brown boot, then his old black one. Holmes totally expects his standard methods to work here. He sends a boy to check the trash of every hotel for the mutilated Times newspaper.
Right.
He chases the cab down Regent Street. He tries to apply logic to the stolen boots.
And he strikes out on all 3. It's amazing. The boy finds no newspaper. The spy in the cab spots Holmes and escapes, and he even mockingly gives his name as Sherlock Holmes to the driver.
Such an insult.
Yeah. And the boot mystery just gets weirder without a clean resolution in the city. It's so jarring. You just don't expect the hero to strike out in the first inning.
It fundamentally destabilizes the reader. The initial investigation in the safe, logical confines of London completely fails. Holmes's grip on the situation is severed. The scientific method basically couldn't catch the ghost in the city.
And because those threads break, the narrative is forced to evacuate. We have to leave the comfortable city. The titles reflect this immediate physical relocation, right? Chapter 6 takes us to Baskerville Hall, and Chapter 7 introduces the Stapletons of Merripit House.
Yeah, we have been exiled from the realm of the rational. London is gaslight, paved streets, police forces. It's a place where Holmes has complete jurisdiction.
Right.
But the hall and the moor are ancient. They're isolated, and they're governed by nature. The titles themselves start to feel heavier, more grounded in specific, remote architecture rather than abstract concepts like problems or threads.
Let's talk about that physical transition, actually, because the book spends a lot of time describing the train ride from civilization into the primitive unknown of Dartmoor. They leave the bright, modern world behind and enter this landscape of jagged granite erectors and Neolithic ruins. The geographical isolation is just complete.
Which leads us into what I consider the most audacious structural shift in the entire book. Act 3, the epistolary isolation. That's chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
Right. Up until now, we've been reading a standard retrospective narrative. Watson is telling us a story that has already happened. We have the comfort of knowing that the narrator survived to write the tale. But suddenly, the format violently fractures.
Yeah. Chapter 8 is First Report of Dr. Watson. Chapter 9 is Light Upon the Moor's Second Report of Dr. Watson. And Chapter 10 is Extract from the Diary of Dr. Watson.
The traditional narrative voice breaks down entirely. We lose the safety of retrospect. We are suddenly plunged into the present tense.
You know, it feels incredibly analogous to a modern found footage horror film.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, think about how those movies operate. You start with standard, objective camera work. You feel safe because there's a director, there's an editor, there's a crew. It's a polished product. But then the objective camera drops. Someone picks up a handheld camcorder, and suddenly you're looking directly through their shaky, terrified, isolated perspective. You're trapped in the woods with them, seeing only what their flashlight illuminates.
I see where you're going with that, but I'd push back just slightly on the found footage analogy.
Okay, why?
Well, in found footage, there's always the implication that the person holding the camera didn't survive, which is why the footage had to be, found. Here, we know Watson lives because he's Holmes's biographer.
Oh, right. That's a fair point. But the visceral feeling in the moment is the same, isn't it? The polished, authorial voice is gone. We're reading Watson's raw, unfiltered dread. We're locked inside Baskerville Hall with him.
Yeah, you're right about that feeling.
He's writing these reports by candlelight while the wind is screaming against the ancient windows. He's hearing a woman sobbing in the middle of the night. He's watching the butler, Barrymore, creep down the hallway to signal someone out on the black, empty moor with a lantern. The isolation is suffocating.
The psychological effect this has on the audience is really profound. Consider the progression of those 3 chapter titles. A report is an official document sent to a superior doct. Watson is writing back to Holmes, who supposedly stayed behind in London.
Right.
It implies duty, structure, and professional detachment.
Mm-hmm.
But then we reach chapter 10, a diary.
A diary is intimate. It's incredibly private.
Oh. Yeah, it's where you write the things you're too frightened to put in an official report. By moving from a report to a diary, Doyle is signaling that Watson's professional detachment is crumbling. The isolation is getting to him. He's admitting his own growing terror, his doubts about the rational explanations, his creeping fear that the curse might actually be real.
And we're isolated right there with him. But Doyle doesn't leave us suffocating forever. The tension has to break. And it does in Act 4, escalation and climax.
The transition out of the diary format signals a return to action. But it isn't a return to safety. The danger that Watson has been agonizing over in his journal suddenly manifests in the physical world.
Chapter 11, The Man on the Tor, introduces a mysterious, active figure in the landscape.
Yeah, Watson sees this tall, thin silhouette standing on a jagged peak against the moon. He thinks it might be the killer, or the spy from London. He hunts this shadow down, creeping into a prehistoric stone hut, revolver drawn, only to hear a familiar voice deduce his presence based on a discarded cigarette stub.
Such a classic Holmes moment. It really is. It's Holmes. He's been hiding on the moor the entire time.
Which is a brilliant structural payoff, but before they can even process this reunion, Chapter 12 delivers on the ultimate threat: death on the moor.
The passive observation of the diary is violently interrupted by a body dropping. They hear the agonizing scream of a man being hunted. They find a body with its skull crushed, wearing Sir Henry's clothes. For a horrifying minute, they think the client is dead. They think they've failed completely.
It turns out to be an escaped convict who was wearing Sir Henry's cast-off wardrobe, but the Hound is real, and it is killing people. The curse is physically manifesting. And then we hit Chapter 13, Fixing the nets. I really want to pause here because this title is in direct dialogue with Chapter 5.
Oh, it's the architectural counterweight to Three Broken Threads.
Yeah. In Chapter 5, the investigation was a fragile thread that snapped, leaving them adrift. They were trying to hold on to something thin, singular, and linear in the middle of a complex city, but by Chapter 13, they're no longer relying on a single thread, they're weaving a net.
They're preparing to catch something massive and dangerous. It's a complete paradigm shift from being reactive to being proactive. They're no longer the hunted victims of a curse. They've become the hunters.
A net implies strategy. It implies multiple points of connection, a trap carefully laid. It requires an understanding of the terrain. They know who the villain is now, Stapleton, the neighbor, but they need to catch him in the act of deploying the Hound. They have built an intellectual structure strong enough to contain the physical threat. They're using Sir Henry as bait.
Which feels incredibly reckless, by the way.
Oh, completely.
I mean, Holmes sends Sir Henry to dine at the Stapleton house alone, telling him he has to walk back across the haunted moor in the dead of night. Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Lestrade are hiding out in the cold, waiting for the Hound to attack. This strategic pivot leads directly, inevitably, into the titular climax in Chapter 14, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
The moment of impact. The curse and the problem colliding in the dark.
And Doyle plays one last trick on them. The net they wove was perfect, except for one thing they couldn't control.
The environment.
Exactly. A thick, impenetrable fog bank rolls in, blinding them. They can hear the giant beast tearing out of the mist before they can even see it. It's described as having fire bursting from its mouth, its eyes glowing. It leaps on Sir Henry, and Holmes has to shoot it point blank to break the illusion.
The monster is killed. The glowing fire is revealed to be a clever preparation of phosphorus. The supernatural is violently dragged back into the realm of the rational. And after the adrenaline of that climax, Doyle gives us Act V, the cool down. Chapter 15 is simply called a retrospection.
They're back in London. It's a crisp winter morning. Months later, the mud of the moor is gone.
It's a vital, necessary exhalation. You can't leave an audience at the peak of a panic attack. The retrospection allows the characters and the listener to sit in a well-lit room, review the blueprints of the trap they just survived, and finally understand how all the gears worked. It restores order to the universe. Holmes explains every missing piece, every broken thread.
So we've walked through the floor plan, we see the trapdoors and the shifting walls, but here is something that I think modern audiences, especially those who have grown up with 100 different film and television adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, just completely miss about this specific book.
Yeah, this is a great point.
We're so used to Holmes being the undisputed center of gravity in every room he enters. The camera loves him. The narrative revolves around his eccentricity. Benedict Cumberbatch, Robert Downey Jr., they just dominate the screen. But look at this blueprint again. For a massive chunk of this book, the entire middle act, from Chapter 6 to Chapter 11, Doyle structurally benches his star player.
He removes the safety net entirely. For chapters on end, Holmes is simply absent from the page. We are left entirely with Watson.
Put yourself in the shoes of a reader in 1901. Doyle had famously killed off Sherlock Holmes in 1893. The public was outraged. People wore black armbands in the streets of London.
It was a huge deal.
Then, years later, Doyle announces a prequel, The Return of Holmes. The public is rabid for another adventure of Sherlock Holmes. They pick up the serialized magazine, and what happens? Doyle yanks Holmes off the stage almost immediately. What does it feel like when the smartest person in the room is suddenly gone?
You feel exposed.
You're left alone with Watson, a very capable man, a brave former soldier, yes, but not a superhuman deductive machine. You're reading his raw, subjective diary entries on a dark moor, wondering if a demon dog is waiting outside the window.
It induces a very specific kind of narrative vertigo. When Holmes is present, we feel invulnerable. No matter how baffling the crime or how terrifying the villain, we know Holmes will figure it out. His presence guarantees a solution.
Right.
By removing him, Doyle strips away our armor. We are forced to experience the mystery not as an intellectual exercise, but as a genuine visceral threat. We're experiencing the events at human scale rather than superhuman scale.
I have to push back on Holmes's strategy here, though. He tells Watson he's staying in London, but he actually hides out on the moor in a ruined stone hut. He lets Watson and Sir Henry endure psychological torture for weeks. He lets an escaped convict get murdered. He risks his best friend's sanity just so he can have a secret vantage point. Isn't that unbelievably arrogant and dangerous?
It's immensely arrogant. It highlights the flaw in Holmes's character. He prioritizes the purity of the investigation over the emotional well-being of his allies. He treats Watson as a piece on a chessboard. But from a structural standpoint, Doyle needed Holmes out of the way so the dread could breathe.
Oh, I see.
Right? If Holmes is standing in Baskerville Hall, the shadows aren't scary. Holmes would just measure the shadow and calculate the angle of the light source.
That makes total sense. It's a brilliant psychological trick by the author. It elevates Watson from a mere chronicler to a true protagonist, but it also makes us hyper-aware of our own vulnerability as listeners. If Watson can't figure it out and Holmes isn't there, what happens to us?
And if we look closely at how Doyle constructs this environment of vulnerability, there are three key motifs and tensions that are clearly mapped out in the chapter titles themselves. Things you should actively keep an ear out for as you experience the story.
The first motif is arguably the biggest presence in the book, aside from the Hound itself. Number one is the moor as a dynamic entity.
We touched on this briefly, but it really deserves deep attention. Look at the chapter titles. The Light Upon the Moor, Death on the Moor. The moor is never just a backdrop. It isn't passive scenery like the streets of London. It's treated syntactically and dramatically as an active participant in the story.
It's a stage where danger manifests, yes, but it also feels like the moor itself has agency. It's described as a prehistoric sea of peat and granite. It hides things in its fogs. It literally swallows people in its bogs. The Grimpen Mire is this terrifying quicksand that traps wild ponies, and you just hear them screaming as they sink.
That detail is so haunting.
It's horrible. It's a hostile, living ecosystem. When you're listening to the descriptions of the landscape, you have to realize that Doyle isn't just setting a scene, he's describing the antagonist. The moor is the physical embodiment of the unknown.
Which brings us directly to the second major tension, which we also mapped earlier. Number two, the metaphor of the investigation threads versus nets.
Right. 3 broken threads versus fixing the nets.
This is about control versus chaos. As you listen, pay attention to how the characters try to impose order on their environment. Early on, they try to follow linear paths, threads. They try to interview a suspect, follow a cab, track a boot print. It's A to B to C.
Right.
But the environment of the moor, the sheer complexity of the deception, snaps those linear threads. A linear approach fails against a multidimensional threat.
I'm trying to visualize this net metaphor in the context of the moor. A thread is singular. If it breaks, you have nothing. But a net is a web. It requires patience to weave. You have to anticipate where the prey is going to run. In this case, Holmes realizes Stapleton is using the Hound to try and scare Sir Henry to death to inherit the Baskerville fortune. So Holmes doesn't just confront Stapleton. He weaves a net. He uses Sir Henry as bait. He brings in Lestrade from Scotland Yard as the muscle. He studies the pathways through the deadly Grimpen Mire. He casts the net across the landscape. Listening for that shift from desperate linear scrambling to calculated multi-directional trapping is incredibly rewarding. You're listening to the evolution of a strategy.
And that strategic evolution is heavily influenced by the third and perhaps most overarching tension in the book. Number 3, the supernatural curse versus the rational problem.
The friction between Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Every single event that happens on that moor, every strange sound, every shadow in the window is constantly being weighed against these two extremes.
Always.
Is that low, rumbling howl in the distance the spectral hound of hell sent to punish a wicked bloodline? Or is it just a very rare bird, as Stapleton claims? Is the glowing beast a demon, or is it a very large earthly dog painted with glowing chemicals?
This is the genius of Doyle's pacing. He keeps the listener oscillating between these two poles. Just when Watson, and by extension, you the listener, convinces himself that there must be a rational explanation, something inexplicably horrifying happens that pushes the needle back toward the supernatural.
It's so stressful.
As you listen, you should monitor your own reactions. When do you find yourself wanting to believe in the curse? Because the human mind is strangely drawn to the romanticism of a curse, even a terrifying one, over the banality of a mundane crime.
It's a constant seesaw of belief. And speaking of listening, we really have to talk about how the medium actually changes the message here. Reading the ink on a page is one thing, but experiencing the story as an audiobook fundamentally alters the texture of the narrative.
The epistolary format we discussed earlier, the reports, the diary is just tailor-made for audio. When you read a diary entry on a printed page, you're still reading a book. But when you hear a skilled narrator shift their vocal performance, drop their volume, perhaps add a slight tremor to their voice as they extract from the diary of Dr. Watson, the barrier between fiction and reality thins dramatically.
Audio inherently mimics the act of someone reading a secret document aloud to you in a quiet room. It's conspiratorial.
Totally.
When Watson writes, "I have only one match left," and the narrator delivers that line into your headphones, you feel the darkness pressing in. It bridges the gap between the listener and the character in a way that visual reading struggles to achieve. The isolation of Baskerville Hall feels incredibly uncomfortably present because the voice is right there inside your head. You aren't just observing Watson's fear, you're sharing his auditory space. You hear the wind, you hear the howl.
And that shared auditory space makes the eventual reemergence of Holmes and the resolution of the mystery so much more impactful. Which leads me to think about why this story, over a century later, still resonates so deeply. It isn't just about a scary dog on a hill in Victorian England.
Not at all. When we look at modern resonance, we see that this book is speaking to a highly contemporary anxiety. We live in a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Right. And when society is confronted with a massive, terrifying unknown, be it a global crisis, an economic collapse, or rapid technological upheaval, we still struggle with that exact same tension Doyle mapped out. We try to categorize our fears. We ask ourselves, are we facing a curse, something existential, uncontrollable, a doom we just have to endure? Or are we facing a problem, a complex puzzle that can eventually be dismantled with data, logic, and effort?
That's a profound parallel. The desire to categorize chaos is a fundamental human survival mechanism. If we label a crisis a curse, we absolve ourselves of the responsibility to solve it. We just bar the doors, hide under the bed, and wait for the Hound to pass.
Wow, yeah.
But if we insist it's a problem, we're obligated to step out onto the moor, face the dark, and start gathering data. Doyle champions the latter. He acknowledges the terrifying allure of the curse, but he ultimately sides with the problem solvers.
And crucially, he shows us how to recover after the problem is solved. I keep coming back to chapter 15, a retrospection. In our current era of constant, overwhelming information, the rapid-fire news cycle, the endless scrolling through catastrophe, we rarely allow ourselves a chapter 15. The crisis happens, the adrenaline spikes, we survive it, and then we immediately move on to the next crisis.
We skip the debriefing entirely. We don't analyze how the net worked or why the threads broke.
Yes. The idea of intentionally sitting down in a quiet room with a friend or a colleague to do a retrospection, to systematically untangle the broken threads after the immediate danger has passed, to understand why we were so afraid and how we survived, that's a lost art.
It really is.
Doyle is telling us that the adventure isn't over when the monster is dead. The adventure is only over when you've made sense of the chaos. This book champions the necessity of reflection. It tells us we need to put the pieces back together to heal.
And if we connect that need for reflection back to the very beginning of our conversation, back to the inception of the story, a beautiful symmetry emerges.
It really does. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We started by looking at that dedication page. The admission that Arthur Conan Doyle needed his friend Robinson to help build the foundation of this masterpiece. If the inception of the most iconic detective story in the English language required collaboration, if Holmes himself couldn't survive more without Watson's diary, Watson's boots on the ground, and Watson's revolver, perhaps the ultimate lesson of the Baskervilles has nothing to do with being a lone, impenetrable genius. Perhaps the blueprint reveals that whether you're writing a novel, solving a murder, or just trying to navigate an increasingly chaotic, modern world, you can't do it entirely inside your own head. We require shared perspectives to survive the moor. The threads will break if you pull them alone. You need someone else to help you weave the net.
Armed with this structural map, the traps and the tension of Doyle's narrative will be sharper and more evident than ever. You'll feel the architectural squeeze. You'll recognize the shift from objective report to subjective terror. You'll understand why you're holding your breath.
And the best way to experience that squeeze, to truly feel the wind on the corridor and hear the shift in Watson's voice, is to step into the auditory landscape yourself. We invite you to experience this architectural marvel by listening to the Claire Narratio audiobook of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Let the narrator guide you through the floor plan, and when the threads break, remember you aren't out there alone.